Hi, I'm Erik, and I'm a UX design director based out of Stockholm. And I've been spending most of my career working in various types of competitive games. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking with you all today about some general learnings, reflections, and thoughts around designing for these types of experiences. So hope you I'm hoping you're going to find it fun, get comfortable, and let's go. See if clicker works. No clicker. There we go. So, it's no secret that competitive gaming is huge, right? I think we're all aware of that. Many of us, I'm sure, engage in competitive games to some degree ourselves, either by playing them or by watching them, right? You can look across the market, and you'll see that some of the biggest and most successful games out there are highly competitive experiences. Games like CSGO pulling in more than 1.3 million concurrent players at any given time. And some of these games have managed to engage players for so long. League came out in 2009. It's crazy how long these games have been going. And you might look at this and see, why isn't game A or game B there? And I think that's part of what makes competitive gaming so interesting as well. It's such a big and diverse market with tons of different genres and games that people can engage in. In fact, you can go as far as to look at games like Farming Simulator, which, as it turns out, has a really active esports scene with teams and tournaments and prizes with up to 200,000 euros sometimes. If you haven't watched the video that People Make Games put out, I think around a month back, around this one in particular, it's super interesting, and I really recommend that you go and give it a watch, because it gives a really fascinating perspective on how competitive games can be so diverse and how it can capture so many different audiences. Now, speaking of audiences, a lot of people are, of course, watching games a lot as well. That's no secret. Looking at Twitch, of course, one of the biggest viewing platforms, pulling in more than 240 million active users. And that's just viewers, right? There's more than 7 million people streaming on the platform every month. And there, a lot of people are watching, and they're making bank with it as well. It's really, really cool. And what I think is really interesting is that when you start to look at some of the data that Twitch in particular is sharing around some of the big competitive games, you start to see just how crazy this little world of ours is. For example, if we take League of Legends, it has, over its lifetime, at least in Twitch data, more than 60 billion hours of watch time on Twitch alone. It's crazy numbers. So suffice to say that as developers, we are, of course, paying really close attention to the element of viewing as well as playing these games. Something that's really cool as well is that the Esports World Cup of 2024 is happening just a couple of weeks from now, actually, down in Saudi Arabia. It's bringing in a ton of different players from all around the world. And what's notable is that it has a pretty hefty prize pool with over $60 million tied to it as well. And when you look at the games on play at the Esports World Cup, you see just how diverse the industry is, which I think is super cool. There's a lot of games that I'm sure you recognize there, but the range of genres and platform is so interesting. And there's some games that I'm sure you might not even recognize yourself looking at this. There's games like Mobile Legends Bang Bang, for example. It's a mobile MOBA that's really big in Southeast Asia, which even has its own women invitational in play during the tournament, which is really cool. There's no Farming Simulator yet, but I'm sure it's just a matter of time and we'll see that play in there as well. Nonetheless, it's a really big event, and it's impressive to see that it has a big prize pool and that there is money to be had in it, right? And there is money in it, right? The global esports market is projected to grow from around $2 billion this year to over $9 billion in 2032. So things are happening. It's big. But it's not all a bed of roses. I think that's no secret as well. Even though the competitive gaming scene is really, really big, it's also had a lot of ups and downs, and sometimes a pretty shaky environment. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the journey of the Overwatch League, for example. This massive bet by one of the biggest publishers in the world that was supposed to change esports forever. With organized teams, salaried players, it was supposed to be a whole new world for esports. And then it all just sort of collapsed. Be that for many different reasons, right? Lack of revenue, a global pandemic certainly didn't help. Whatever the case, it just kind of fell apart, even though it was this massive bet by such a big publisher. And now we'll see, they're making changes and it's becoming better, but it goes to show that like, even though we're trying to make esports into this massive thing, and it should be as big as real sports, right? We still have a long way to go. And we're trying to bridge that gap into real sports. And there's no better way of doing that than going to the Olympics, right? Which esports did. Even just last year, we had in Singapore the esports Olympics, which is super cool on paper, but when you look at the execution, it leaves quite a lot to be desired as well. There are some familiar games that I'm sure a lot of us recognize there. Gran Turismo, Just Dance was there. But then there's stuff like VR Taekwondo and things that we wouldn't necessarily maybe connect with competitive gaming when we think about it. And fair enough, the Olympics committee has a pretty strict line that they don't want any digital violence in their events. I think we can all respect that. But there's also this big push for virtual sports in everything they do that I feel really kind of misses the mark on the promise of what competitive gaming can be and all of the promises that the market has, basically. So suffice to say, there's still a lot of room to grow. Despite all the ups and downs then, right, competitive gaming is huge. It's really cool. It's a really fun part of this wonderful industry that we call gaming. And I personally, I've been part of this industry now for around 12 years, working with UX in various competitive games, which means I've gone through the gauntlet of being called an interaction designer, UI UX designer, experience designer, engagement designer. You can put really any name you want. Labels in the games industry are broken. I think we know that. You can call me whatever you want, honestly. I don't really care. I really like designing experiences for these type of games, right? And I like thinking about how players interact and engage with this type of competitive experience. For the last year or so, I've been working as a UX director at a smaller startup in Stockholm called Goals, which is working to bring competitive gaming back to the football game genre with the game Goals. So we're working on a free-to-play competitive football game that we're hoping to put into early access sometime next year, although we're already live now with a bunch of playtesters, and that's something you'll see me talk about a little bit more during this talk as well. So today, here then, I want to cover 3 different topics around this that sits very close to my heart, and hopefully you'll find interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can make better competitive games by involving our community in our development process earlier. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some general UX thinking around designing for playing and viewing these type of games. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the issue of toxicity and some of the solutions we can look at to improve games for everyone, really. But before we get there, I think it's worth just thinking a little bit of time talking about what is it that makes a game competitive. How do we define a competitive game, right? And when we think about competitive games, the thing that often pops into people's minds is stuff like fair play, right? That idea of integrity, playing by the rules, and accepting loss, these kind of things. And that's certainly a big, big part of it. But I also want to highlight 2 other elements that I think is very, very important when it comes to defining competitive games. For one, they generally come with a pretty high grade of consistency and predictability. We try to remove as many random elements as we can, right? And secondly, they tend to come with this measurable improvement of skill. We talk about having a really high skill ceiling, right? That's an important part in these games. So you always feel like you can grow and get better in them. But if we take a step back, just for a moment, I think it's also really interesting to ask ourselves, what is it that keeps us playing these games? These games that can evoke such strong emotions, having us throw the controller at the TV and rage and walk away and never want to play the game, yet we come back and we play more every single time. To do that, I want to put on my science hat for just a moment, bear with me, and I want to talk about chocolate. Specifically, I want to talk about a chocolate research study that was done at Harvard back in 2013. In this study, researchers basically gave a delicious piece of chocolate to a bunch of test subjects. And then they sent them home, and they split them into 2 groups. One group, they sent home and said, you cannot eat any more chocolate for the coming 2 weeks. The other group, they gave a massive pile of chocolate, and they sent them home and said, basically, eat as much chocolate as you can possibly stomach without getting physically ill in the 2 weeks ahead. And then they brought them back 2 weeks later, and they gave them another piece of chocolate. And they asked them, well, how did you like it? How are you feeling now? And who did you think liked the new piece of chocolate more? Well, it was the group that abstained from eating for 2 weeks. And this is a phenomenon that's really interesting that's called hedonic adaptation. And it's kind of based on the fact that we get used to nice things over time until the point where they are not nearly as pleasurable for us anymore. It's the reason why We buy a new car, for example, and after a few months, it just doesn't feel as exciting anymore. We listen to that new song that we love over and over and over until it doesn't really feel as good, and we don't want to listen to it anymore. And it's the same reason, I think, why games with generally pretty short, repeatable core loops that brings us in and out of source of frustration or joy pretty fast tends to be something we engage with a lot more over time. There's a continuation on this concept called the hedonic treadmill. And that concept basically points to the fact that we as human beings, we all have a sort of happiness baseline in our lives. And when we're exposed to sources of great happiness or great negativity, we, no matter what happens, tend to come back to this baseline over a short amount of time. So when we're chasing those wins, we're on that massive kill streak, we're doing really, really, really great. We're feeling great, right? And then we come out of this core loop, we tend to return to this baseline. And the same thing when we're on a horrible losing streak, right? We're feeling super frustrated and we just don't want to play anymore. The core loop is usually short enough and engaging enough that it takes us out and it allows us to come back to this baseline so that, you know, maybe I'll try one more time. And we're going to keep chasing those highs, right? Just one more win. If I just go on one more win streak, I'm going to feel a little bit better. And I think that's really interesting, and it points to kind of how we keep playing these games. And you might look at this and hear me say this and go like, that doesn't sound like a very positive thing. That sounds like a little bit like dark. And in a sense, I think you're right. It's not necessarily always a positive thing in these kind of games. But I think it's super important that we are open and talking about the fact that there's a nuanced environment where it can be both positive and negative. If we want to design better experiences, better competitive experiences, we need to talk about how they can become healthier and more sustainable over time as well. But let's leave the chocolate and the science behind for now and get back on track. All in all then, there's a whole bunch of different motivations to why players play these kind of competitive games. It might be that sense of variability, always having something new to chase, even though the core loop might be the same, you're coming up against new players every time, so the game feels really fresh and dynamic. It might be that intrinsic sense of challenge, right, of wanting to become better, wanting to compete. Or it can also be a motivation for seeking social relationships, creating a reputation for yourselves, and finding other like-minded people or a community. And I think that last one is extremely powerful. And it's one of the things that I found is maybe one of the greatest strengths that we can lean on when developing these types of competitive games and experiences. So I want to talk a little bit more in detail about the community, and specifically the idea of how involving the community during your development process can help us build stronger competitive games. To start off, I want to make a statement that I think sits sort of at the core of successfully working with the community. And that is that you have to be authentic. If you don't speak with your voice, if you're not ready to open up and be vulnerable and have a conversation with your community, you're going to fail. Because your community will always be looking for a conversation. And if you're not ready to have that conversation, you're not going to feel authentic and you're not going to build a relationship with them. Some of you might remember this quote. This is what Blizzard said back in 2016 when asked by the community if they have ever considered bringing back classic World of Warcraft servers. And this, to me, is a pretty good example of how not to do it, right? And yeah, you might feel like the community doesn't know the right answer, even though like that they are wrong sometimes. And it's in fact pretty likely that they don't have the right solution. But they do know the problems that they have. And when they're voicing their problems to you, you need to be willing to listen. And I mean, credit to Blizzard. They've done amazing work with working with the community over the years. So I'm not trying to throw any shade, but it's still a pretty interesting example. I can bring it a little bit closer to home as well, and look at this quote. This, I think, still sits as the most downvoted comment on Reddit history to this day. This is what we at DICE posted to our community soon after the launch of Star Wars Battlefront 2, when the community started expressing quite a bit of concern around the time and cost involved in having to unlock characters within the game. And again, because we didn't feel very authentic and speaking to them and having a conversation, it just really didn't hit home. Another thing that's really, really important is the idea of sharing, and sharing early. And that's another big lesson that I want to push at. And I realize this is starting to sound a bit like a therapy session, but it's okay, you're comfortable, you're sitting down, so just relax and enjoy. When I started at Goals, I came from an experience working primarily in AAA before. right? And in AAA, we don't necessarily share it to that same degree, outside of like really polished marketing assets. So it was a real learning experience coming to a place where we kind of opened the door and said, hey, look at what we're doing, and sharing in a much more transparent way. But there's a couple of reasons why I think this is so important. Number one, you start learning as developers and as a team how to take in feedback and hear what the community is saying. And it's so important in particular if you are even maybe experienced as individual developers, new as a team, and you're learning together. And secondly, you start to build a rapport with your community, right? They start understanding what work in progress means, which makes it so much easier to share over time. These are a couple of examples from the founder of Goals, Andreas, and how we practice sharing. And what Andreas is basically doing is that he's going into my Figma files, just picking random shit and saying, hey, can I just show this to the community? And I don't know about you, if you're a designer in the audience and you're working in these Figma files and you have someone going in and digging in them, it's a little bit like having someone going through your dirty laundry. But I really come to appreciate it. It's actually super valuable. Now, one thing that's inevitably going to happen is that you start getting reactions, sometimes very loud and very opinionated ones. So I think as we've all been there as developers, right? We've had to deal with that vocal minority, right? We learned that it's something that we shouldn't listen to. We should practice ignoring it and avoiding that vocal minority, because it's a very small part of your player base that can be very, very vocal and sort of over-index on various particular types of feedback. And I think that's certainly true, but the premise in competitive games is, I believe, slightly different. It's, of course, a super fine balance, and if you don't tread carefully, you can end up designing like completely inaccessible experiences. But this small part of your community, this very vocal group, that sort of plays at the peak of the competitive part of your game, is something that you want the other parts of your player base to look up to and to aspire to. So it's really important that you practice listening to those and involving them in the conversation as well. This changes a lot during the journey of any development, of course. In the beginning, you need to rely a lot on your own vision and intuition when building the right experience, right? Data, even voices from the community, is so much harder to listen to when you don't have a clear vision for your game that's well-defined yet, right? As you move further on, this gets easier and easier. And you start being able to take in data, be it numbers or voices from the community, right? Through all this, though, one thing remains absolutely true and critical. It's your vision as a game maker. And especially when you're inviting a community in to have opinions early on, it's so important that you have that Northern Star set for yourself and for your team, and that you can express it towards the community. Because otherwise, you and your team, you're going to end up running in different directions, depending on whatever loud voice is out there and is being heard right now. And this is always true when it comes to setting a direction for any type of game. But it's all the more important if you're inviting for feedback early. You can't draw too many conclusions from such a small data set. These are some examples, again, of Andreas tweeting. And they make good examples, so I'm going to keep showing you tweets. We're constantly getting impressions and opinions based on the various sort of work-in-progress state of our game that we're working on. But we know what type of experience we're building. We have the vision pretty set for ourselves. And that means that we're not going out and we're trying to defend and appease every opinion and feedback we go. We're just trying to make sure that we can vocalize towards our community, towards whoever has thoughts about our game, that this is the game we're trying to build, which leads to us getting much more constructive and efficient feedback as well. And that's another point I want to highlight. Practice getting feedback with your team. The last thing that you want to do is you don't want to find yourself live with a game with a team that isn't well-versed in taking feedback. It's a muscle that you have to practice, just like any other muscle, right? So take the time and present stuff like user research findings, Reddit posts from the community, long threads from Discord. Sit down with your team or yourself if you're a solo dev and practice going through it, talking about it, reacting to it, right? Because it's so important that you learn and grow so that you don't end up in a live environment and you're not well-versed in taking that feedback. And the thing about getting to live and being live, I think, is really important. Because a point I want to make is that there's a lot of value in considering yourself as a live game, even when you're early in development, when you're working closely together with your community. Now, there are games that go into full stealth mode, right? That's still a thing. AAA for sure, right? They disappear for 8 years and then they go out. And there's definitely something to that scarcity of coming out from nowhere and blowing up and having a massive hype around the game. But for new teams, and competitive games in particular, I think, There is so much value in learning to be live before it's too late. Our game at Goals, for example, we have it live with our playtesters, and we've had like more than 10,000 matches played. And it's given us so much valuable data on our game and how it plays. But it's also like had us mature and grow a lot on our team around like, okay, what do we actually need to run a live service and to be, active and to have a game that's out there. And one part of that that's been really, really important is giving our players the tools to organize themselves. Because it's when you start providing the way for players to kind of organize themselves and play amongst themselves that you start to see that grassroots community movement that is really the start of your competitive journey in any game that you're building. So having community members playing with themselves, having creators being able to play with their community is absolutely critical to us. So what we did, and I know many others do, is just expose the same tools we're using internally to play our game and playtest it. Starting off with simple, browsers where you can just join the game, add passwords so that it can be private. But then as we've grown and as we've scaled, even though we haven't gotten to the point of building, say, complex social systems, we've still done, the simplest, cheap versions of that with having like code invite systems and lobby codes so that people can organize and play matches and grow together. And it's been super useful to us because we've seen how the community can organize themselves around that as it starts sort of having a life of its own. And what it has allowed us to do, which has been amazing, is host our first sort of internal esports tournaments. Even though we're like pre-alpha development, we went out and said, okay, we're going to try it. We're just going to try to run a tournament and see how that feels as a team towards our community and see how it goes. And it was so valuable. Not only because we had a bunch of like try-hard, sweaty players go in and play like at their best of their abilities, because we threw a little bit of money in the prize pool as well. So they tried every exploit, every abuse they could find, right? But also as a team in terms of how we needed to grow to learn to communicate around this type of event, both inside and outside of the game as well. Now, I'll be honest, and we screwed up so much doing this the first time as well. We had no idea what we were getting into when it came to planning around this and having some type of production plan. It was painful. But that's part of the process, right? I'd rather us do it now than when we're live with hopefully millions of players, right? So it's such a good learning experience. One thing that you'll start seeing as you're doing this, you're starting to provide the tools for your community so that they can play the game. You start to have this grassroots movement. You start to see these voices bubble up, right? The people that show up every day on your Discord server, giving valuable feedback, inviting new players in and introducing them to the game, even though like you're not present yourself. And that's the last point I really want to push on. Find your champions in the community and nurture them and grow them, because they will set the tone for your entire community going forward early on. So it's so important to kind of be there and nurturing and growing them. The way we did it at Goals when we started the studio, so Andreas, the founder, is an old CS world champion, and he wanted to create this game solving some of the frustrations that the community, the competitive community in particular, around football games had been expressing. So he went out to the community and he looked for like-minded people that were sharing and being constructive about this. And he basically built a game design team around it with a bunch of old pro FIFA players that knew so much about the frustrations that the community were having. And as we've been growing our team and our studio, as we have an active Discord community, we're bringing them in, we started to see these champions rise up. So we went one step further. And when we needed to grow our team, particularly in the QA department, we hired people from our Discord server. So like, you've been amazing. You're constantly providing valuable feedback about the core gameplay. So we hired them and made them internal QA members. And they've been amazing because they came up and they wanted to really show that they could do something good. And they provided so much valuable feedback to us. So those are some thoughts around what I believe can be done in terms of involving the community and making better competitive games around that. I want to just, preface that, mind you, that Goals, our game, is not live yet in that sense. We're early live, which means that I can't say that, like, yeah, this worked amazingly and it allowed us to grow to 20 million players, right? You'll have to ask me in a couple of years and we'll see if it actually works. But it has worked really well for us, and I think there's something to it. The next part then that I want to talk about is a little bit about UX design for esports. Now, there's a big discussion online around how in the world do you spell esports. Is it a big E? Is it a big S? Very heated opinions. This is the ultimate solution. You put it all in capital letters, no one will be the wiser. You have no idea how I spell this. When we think about use cases for user experience for esports, we often think about this, right? Players playing at the peak of their competitive ability and being like really hardcore about it. They're really pro players. But the reality is that it often starts like this, right? A couple of friends on the couch competing against each other, someone picking up against the game for the first time and getting absolutely crushed by their friends. We've all been there. The most pro competitive players out there have been there. So as designers, it's so important that we take that into consideration and uses that as sort of as part of our journey so that we can help grow the players' skills into becoming that competitive, successful players. Now, not everyone is going to make it. We know that. That's a natural part of the process. But our job is to make sure to provide the tools so that as many players as possible can have a successful and enjoyable competitive experience coming from a novice part of the game, right? And when we talk about player skills, I like to kind of separate it in 3 different categories. The first one is mechanical skills. That's when we're just getting into the game and we're starting to think about like controls, movement and abilities. Like we're just focusing all of our sort of cognitive energy, all of our mental power on just figuring out like how do I walk and how do I run. As we start to get a little bit more proficient in games, we start to feel a little bit more comfortable with the controls. We start to move on to what we like to call awareness skills. This is when you start reading the game a little bit more. You start thinking about things like match state. What's the score right now? What cooldowns? Do I have abilities ready that I could use? Where's the enemy? What's the position right now? Where are they on the radar? And how can I play with that? And you start to spend more and more of your sort of mental power on that aspect. Now, as that journey goes on, though, and players start to feel comfortable with the controls, comfortable with reading the game, they move on to the third skill, which is the cognitive skills. And this is really like the next level skill ability that a lot of these competitive players have. That's where you start thinking beyond what is just happening in the game right now, right? It's when players start predicting movement and thinking like, okay, the enemy is here right now, but where are they going to be a few seconds from now? What are the tactics I could use? So what are loadouts, class selections, these kind of things, right? The real meta skills and thinking around, how do I play successfully in the game? Now, these 3 together, mechanical skills, awareness skills, and cognitive skills, I think make out the sort of umbrella of skills that we need to consider as designers for competitive games and thinking about like what kind of tools do we have out there that we could do to grow all of these skills. Some are easier than others, right? We often do a lot around mechanical skills, but maybe there's more we could do around cognitive skills as well. What I think is really interesting, though, is if we start to look at this on the journey from being a novice to going all the way to being like an expert player. At the start of any player's journey, as I said, right, we're so focused on just the mechanical skills. All of our mental power is kind of going to that. We have 0 reserves for thinking about, strategies or anything like that. But as the player goes through and becomes more and more sort of capable, they start to shift that sort of energy towards, not thinking at all about mechanical skills and thinking more about the cognitive skills. And the reason I think this is so interesting is that sometimes we get caught up, particularly I would argue as UX designers thinking about these things. Thinking about like how HUD design, for example, is like a 0-sum game. We can only throw so much information on the screen. But I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And it's important that we take the journey of the player into account so that we can think about how that experience and complexity can also grow over time as they progress and grow over time as well. Another part that I think is super important around this is managing player attention. Because attention is maybe the most precious resource we have as designers, UX designers in particular, designing for these type of experiences. And I want to give an example from a game I worked on, Battlefield 1. I don't know if you're familiar with the game. It's a World War I shooter. And in this game, there are flamethrowers. Flamethrowers are nasty. You can, of course, use them, but it also means you can be exposed to them. And being a pretty immersive and visceral game, there's a lot of horrible things that happen then. You see flame effects all over your screen. You're having some soldier dude standing with a flamethrower blasting in your face. Your soldier is screaming on the top of his lungs, and your health is going down, and you're dying. This is a pretty nasty place to be in. Now, Battlefield being a sandbox type of game, the game designers had a really cool idea, because we want to have like this rock, paper, scissors experience where you can counter everything that happens. So we added the ability to the game that players could throw themselves on the ground, basically simulating, throwing yourself on the ground and rolling around to put out a fire, right? So you could press a button, throw yourself prone, and you will stop being on fire and hopefully not die. Of course, being a multiplayer game, we didn't really have that many tutorials and teaching moments. So what did we do? Well, we threw up a little window on the screen when it happens that said, hey, player, you appear to be on fire. If you just press this button and throw yourself on the ground, you're going to survive. At the same time as the player is on fire, they're screaming their hearts out, they have the enemy in front of them, and their health is going down. Do you think a lot of players paid attention or saw this little text window? No, it did not work very well. So we have to think about the context of attention. Another really good example of this that I like a lot is from Elden Ring. This is from a video series that I'm sure some of you have watched, otherwise I really recommend it. This is this guy that takes complex video games and have their partner play it for the very first time. Their partner not being a particularly hardcore gamer and not really maybe within the usual user base for this type of games. So they do it for Elden Ring. And Elden Ring has a tutorial area, like this little cave you can go in. And they do what many other games did, Battlefield included, in that we throw some little prompts on the screen to show you the basic controls you can do. Now, this is a pretty calm moment in the game, right? There's no hostiles nearby, there's just a little cliff that the player needs to jump on, so we throw a little jump prompt on the screen. But if you watch this video, you'll see that for many, many times, the player is just getting completely stuck, having no idea what they do. And this is not even a hectic moment, just because this player is so engrossed and wrapped up in the newness of it all, and everything is just overwhelming. So it's you have to consider that it's not just about how much information you throw on screen. It's also the context of the player and where they come from and what mood they're in, right? There's so many elements to that. Now, Elden Ring does different things as well, right? Sometimes in the game, they throw up a big screen and say they even pause the game, which they don't normally do other places in the game, right? And they show really important information about how you change from dual wielding and things like that. And same thing here, because the player was in a moment where oh shit, there's an enemy behind the screen and I'm going to go into combat and they're all hyped up, they were in zero context to take this in. They're just close, get it away from me, I don't want to see this, right? So we have to consider these things. We have to consider how we can manage attention, because one of the things we'll find is it's so hard to pull the player's view and actually have them focus on the right thing. I say all that, but then there's also this. I'm sure some of you have been like this as well. I was like this. If you were a hardcore World of Warcraft trader back in the days, this was a pretty usual way to play the game. That was pretty normal, right? And I think this is important to consider as well, right? It's not about only making those clean experiences and making sure that prompt is visible. Because for some players, this is completely fine. Because these players, they learn to filter away all the information they don't need, but they want that information available when they need it, at a moment's notice. And again, that's why it's so important to think about that journey, right? Just as we're thinking about how we're moving from the mechanical skills to the cognitive, as the player is going through this journey, they're growing, for example, their awareness skills and their ability to take in more and more information. We should also think about it that the sort of complexity of how much we can ask when it comes to attention can grow as well. And I think that's really interesting, just how can we consider that on the journey of the player, essentially. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk more about viewing these types of games instead of just playing them. Because as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, viewing these type of competitive games is a big part of what makes them really, really popular as well. It's something we need to consider as designers. And one of the first things that I like as an interesting reflection I've had is I think there's a lot that we can do to learn from real-life sports when it comes to designing viewable experience for competitive games. Because sports, for many, many years, have mastered the craft of showcasing their events to big audiences, be it in real life or on TV, in really, really good ways. And I think there's a lot we can look at and learn there. And one thing that they do often, right, that sport has, that is a bit of a luxury, is that they often have a very clear focus point that you can always look at. Football is a good case there, right? Because there's one football. That's the focal point for the entire gameplay. So it's very easy. And when you see how football broadcasts are, for example, being shown on TV and even live, right, and in the audience, you can see that they put so much thought into how they're driving that attention and making sure that the right thing is in the focal point. And there's a lot of games they can learn from that. Rocket League being a great example, right? They basically have the same problems to solve. So the Rocket League devs can go and they can look at, for example, how football broadcasts are being done and learn a lot from how they are moving the focal point and sort of bringing attention to the player. The reality is that sports have been doing the opposite for quite some time. Real-life sports, if you go and look at any sports these days, it's basically like a video game stream in some cases. They put so much extra digital information on screen, and they've done so much looking at games in terms of how they visualize data, that a lot of the opposite is happening. In fact, some sports broadcasts have gone so far into almost becoming video games themselves, right? They even put it in a video game wrapper and stream it to a video game. So the opposite is happening. I think there's a lot to be done for video games to look at it as well. Of course, not all games are able to lean on this. Games like League, for example, when you're watching League, there's usually a ton of important focal points happening at any given time. there's a whole different range of complexities that isn't necessarily true for a simple game like football, for example. When we think about viewing games, then, we often think about it in this perspective. This is the sort of the end goal, right? The big stage, the live event. This is what we all aspire to. The reality, though, is that it more often looks like this, right? From a single player's perspective, sort of watching the screen, and often through streaming online, right? That's often where it starts. And that's sort of where we need to start considering as designers, designing these types of experiences. So even though we might think of a game looking like this, from a viewer perspective, it's more often looking like this, right? With a bunch of additional information, social feeds and cameras and all this type of extra additional information that the viewer is consuming at the same time as they are being exposed to what's happening in your game. Depending on the game, it can go even crazier. Like if you watch a live event or a tournament of like CS or League or anything, there's so much additional information that they're putting up on the screen for the viewers to make it more engaging and interesting for the players. So I think it's really important that we consider that. Like, what can we do to design for these additional layers? How do we, as designers, take information beyond just like the heads-up display that the players are seeing to make it more engaging and interesting for the viewer? Some of my favorite examples of this comes from Twitch extensions. So Twitch extensions, if you're not aware, is this basically a plugin that Twitch allows developers to do that adds additional layers on top of the viewing experience of their games that integrates closely with the actual game experience. On the left here is an example from Dota, where they basically allow players to go and look at tooltips for which hero is being used, what abilities are on cooldown. And this is really important because what often ends up happening is that players that come to view your games are doing it from the perspective of learning. It's a big, especially if you're trying to learn something competitively, watching other people play is one of the most common ways of doing it, right? So supporting that can be extremely powerful for your game as well. On the right, we're seeing an example from League of Legends. They've done an extension where you can lean much more on the competitive, right? You can see exactly who's in the game right now. But you can also see if they are a quote-unquote pro player and if they're on a big winning streak. And it makes the experience really engaging because you can go and see like, oh shit, they're on like a 5 winning streak and they're about to lose this one. How are they going to come back from it? And it makes it really interesting and engaging. If you've ever watched, for example, live events from games like Hearthstone, what they also do is they always expose exactly what is going on in the game from both players' perspective. And this is really important from the perspective that it makes the viewer sort of be able to read the minds of the player. It makes the viewer feel a little bit smart. And I think this is really interesting, that ability to kind of help a viewer to read the minds of the player to become a little bit more engaged in what is actually going on. And we're seeing a lot of examples in that are out there, like fighting games that expose all the controls, for example, all the input the players are doing, games like StarCraft that shows you both the construction cues for both players. It allows you to go into the head of the player a little bit as a viewer, and it becomes that much more engaging. And I think that's really important because we all want to feel smart. And I think we've all been there to some degree as sort of viewers of games, where we look at something and we say, you know, I could have done that so much better. Why did I do it this way? I could have played so much better. And that makes us feel good, and it's engaging. So I think we can lean on that as developers and do a lot more. Now, I want to go a little bit old school and talk about something that I want to see more of as well. When I started off in games back in 2013, this was the first game I worked on. This was a companion experience for Battlefield 4, where you could play part of the game on a tablet and basically connect to the bigger game experience. Now, the mid-2010s was a very different part, like reality when it came to the game industry. Everyone was doing companion apps and second screens, right? Every game, every publisher out there were doing it. But a lot has happened since. It was a very different world in many different ways. To give you an example, this is official EA marketing from back in 2013. This is me inside of a fridge in the DICE office playing our companion game. This is what EA felt like, yeah, this is marketing. This is official stuff. We'll put this online and make an ad of it. A lot has happened in the last few years. Anyway, what that game did, which was really interesting, was it had these second screens experiences where you, as a player, could take part of the experience and sort of extend it beyond just a single view. If you had a monitor or a tablet, you could, for example, take the map of the game and expose it. So for those players that had reached that point of really being able to take in more information, wanting a more strategic view, we could allow that. And that was really valuable for that type of competitive player. But we kind of lost that somewhere on the way. And I want to bring it back. Because in real-life sports, we're already seeing it, right? If you're watching a football game and you're seeing in the stands, everyone is on their phones at the same time. They're being on the social communities, they're chatting, they're looking at stats for players. They're engaging outside of just a match. And I think there's a case in bringing that back for games as well. Because there is something there in sort of keeping viewers engaged, both inside and outside of your game experience. So that's something. I want to see more second screen experience happening. All right, let's move on. We talked a little bit about evolving the community, and we talked a little bit about UX for esports. So before I end today, I want to talk a little bit about toxicity and what we can do in competitive games to combat those things. It's a very real problem. I think that most of us are aware of it. Toxicity is a constantly growing trend that we see in games. This is from a research study that Unity did, and we see it growing over every year in terms of like how many players find themselves being exposed to toxicity. And when we look at the type of games that are trending very high, we see that competitive games in particular over-index a lot when it comes to toxicity as well. So why is that? Well, I think there's a number of reasons, but I want to highlight a few of them. First, a lot of toxic behavior stems from insecurity. Combined with the feeling of anonymity on the internet, it leads to a stronger risk of players expressing themselves in ways they wouldn't necessarily do normally when engaging with a human being, right? There is no doubt hate out there as well, unfortunately. People that simply don't belong in our games because of their inability to coexist in any type of productive way, especially competitively, with other human beings. And nothing that we will do in terms of encouraging them to play more nicely is going to help. But what I think is perhaps the most interesting is that a lot of what is perceived as toxic behavior stems from misunderstanding as well. That aspect of sort of human ambiguity, combined with being online and only having voice or only having text, leads to a lot of cases where what might not have been meant as a toxic behavior from the sender is very much perceived as such from the receiver. That's why it has become so important to be really, really clear toward our players in terms of what actually happened and why did we action on you and what did you do that was actually perceived as a toxic behavior. There's some great examples of this, such as Rocket League, right? Rocket League has done a really great job in not only showing you that you were banned for being toxic, but also showing you, for example, a little snippet of the text chat, showing you exactly what it was you said and did that led to this action being taken upon you, right? And on the sender's end, they also get a little nice feedback that, yes, it was action upon, which makes them feel really encouraged to engage and do more things in terms of like reporting toxicity. So when we take punitive actions against our players to combat toxicity, I think one of the most powerful things we can do is to provide really clear reasoning towards them, why they were impacted the way they were. Because what has been shown in a bunch of different research is that when we do that, the risk of them becoming repeat offenders and being toxic again lowers drastically. Because they might have thought that they weren't being toxic, but based on the receiver, they really were. Now, there will always be an amount of shit-talking in competitive games. I think that's unavoidable. And competitive banter can be healthy, I think, to some degree. Because we want to encourage players to communicate. It's a big part of playing competitively. But even the most well-meaning tools will often be used in ways we don't intend. Before I joined Goals, I was working on a kind of CS-like competitive shooter called Alara Prime. And we offered a feature in that game that was really appreciated by the competitive community. You could draw on the map, right? It was a very strategic game where you would like, okay, which lane are we going to take? How are we going to go and find the opponents, right? Well, let's go left. No, let's go right. This was quite useful. What do you think happened the moment we put this out towards the community? Well, if you're not familiar with this term, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is exactly what happened. If you're not yet familiar, count yourself blissfully unaware. If you ever put any type of freedom of creativity towards your players, TTP is a thing you're going to be exposed to. So even the most well-meaning communication tools can, in the wrong hands, be used for toxic behavior. Still, though, nonverbal communication is maybe one of the most powerful things we can do to remove some of that human ambiguity and combat some of that toxic behavior. And games have been doing this really well for a long time. From really social behaviors in World of Warcraft, like inventing other languages, to ping system in a competitive setting for Apex, and many other different ways, right? From social to competitive. But even so, like I mentioned, these tools are not without fault. I'm sure anyone that has played Hearthstone has been spammed with the thanks emote as they're crushing you mercilessly. Doesn't feel too great. Maybe the most famous non-verbal toxicity behavior there is, the teabag, right? It's very hard to combat these things. So even though communication is really, really important, I think it's also important that we as developers really consider our communication needs. Because a large part of toxicity comes specifically from like text and voice chat, right? So anything we can do to remove some of that ambiguity and use other tools will inevitably lead to lowering toxicity as well. Something that a lot of games do these days is code of conducts. They're very cheap to put in your game, and they're a statement, but I feel like they are a little bit toothless. Game developers have gotten better in being clear and verbose about what they expect from their communities. But any player is just going to, yeah, click, 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 and I'm through. Like, not many will think about this and actually have it with them. One of my favorite examples of doing this in a more better way is Botany Bay in good old RuneScape. I don't know if anyone of you remember this. This was used primarily for bots, but it's such a great implementation that I want to use it as an example. Now, what happened in RuneScape was that when a bot or a hacker got sort of banned or was about to be banned, they were teleported to this Botany Bay, and players in the server were called to join in on the judgment of this player. And then a judge appears, and they give them a passionate speak about like how they ruin the community and how this behavior is non-tolerant in our game. Then the players that are present is given a chance to vote. What should be the punishment of this bot, this hacker, this toxic player? And this punishment can range from getting crushed by the claw of justice or swallowed by an abyssal worm. Like, they get really creative with it. And as players, you could even walk up and grab like rotten tomatoes and throw at the player that's standing and is about to be sentenced. And this is so much more impactful, right? Compared to just like a little code of conduct. This is something that players were talking about for a long time in terms of like, oh, you got sent to Botany Bay. Like, yeah. Of course, this is super expensive to do compared to a code of conduct. But that's something I want to make a point of. Fighting toxicity is an investment. It doesn't come cheap. It's a continuous cost. And if we were serious about it, we need to take that into account when we plan our projects, right? We need to, from a production level, be willing to pay for these things, right? Because if we want to make a significant impact on toxicity, it's something we just have to do. Now, I want to round off today with one last thought when it comes to toxicity. And that is something that I found happens a lot in games and in real life to some degree as well. When we are surrounded by positivity, constructive conversations, like non-toxic behavior, it tends to lead to us becoming more positive and constructive ourselves, right? Toxic players, you see sometimes even like engaging on social media, when they are met by really positive constructive behavior, they flip on a dime and like, oh shit, like I didn't mean to be toxic. Sorry, I was having a bad day, and they get very positive. And we spend so much time in our communities, outside of our games, on Discord and whatever, to nurture and build this positive behavior. We have super talented community managers all across the industry that does this for a living. And something I want to see more of in the industry is to kind of bring this a little bit closer to the game experience as well. And I think just as bringing the community with you on the game development journey, by bringing that positive aspect and that constructive dialogue that you have with your community closer to the game experience, not just on the periphery, not just on the second screen, not just on Discord or whatever, I think there's so much more we can do to combat toxicity, because positivity begets positivity. All right, so we spoke a little bit about community and involving them in development. We spoke a little bit about UX and esports, and a little bit about dealing with toxicity, high and low. But I hope you found it interesting. These are some of the aspects that I find really interesting when it comes to designing for competitive games. And that's all I have for today. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Erik. And now we do have time for a couple of questions. Do we see hands rising up? Well, I will start and ask, you said that the second screen is what you want to see coming back. What UX decisions you want to see going out in the future?
Ooh, UX decision, I want to see going out. I think social hubs need to go. Speaking of social games and stuff, it's such a fad. Social hubs, don't do them. Everyone just throws them into the games because they think social, but then they don't put any significant investment or value on it. So, thumbs down to social hubs.
Hey, Ludus from Stinky Box. I just wanted to ask regarding the last part, regarding the toxicity part. And would you say the better way would be awarding the positive behavior while fighting the toxicity?
Yep.
And could you give us some examples, maybe good examples about that? Thank you.
There's some great examples for sort of rewarding positive behavior to fight toxicity. Rainbow Six Siege is a great example of this. They have this honor system in the game now, right? Where they actually have almost like a progression rank, a standing, a social standing for players, where depending on where they sit on that axis, you know, they get commended positively by other players at the end of every game. It will unlock additional rewards and just make it really like better for you and a more rich experience. Now it goes on the other end as well, right? If you end up on the lower end of the spectrum, you're sort of disqualified from ranked matchmaking and other things like that, right? But they're trying to really reward that positive behavior. So there's definitely some good examples of that out there as well.
Let's take one more question there.
Yeah, hello, thank you. One more question about toxicity from players. Yeah, most interesting topic, I think. You was talking about how we can fix toxicity from not good players in the game, but in most games, I think the target where we're going is not about making other players happy, but bringing emotions from them. And in that case, we're not interested in fighting too hard against toxic players. So actually, most games do nearly nothing against it, and we're still in the same position. It's not fair, yeah?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and particularly in competitive games, it isn't black and white, right? Because you want some like aspect of competitive banter and a little bit. Fighting games is a great example of this, right? There's been a lot of examples there where, for example, they use stuff like playing more poorly or non-optimized to basically mess with their opponent's head. Not being toxic, but like basically abusing them psychologically by showing that like, I'm going to crush you, so I'm going to play worse just to get into your head. So like there is this aspect of like, yeah, you're not there to just hug and be friends. Like it's still like competition, right? But I think there's still a nuance between that and being like full-on toxic or hateful, right? So there's a degree of value there.
Do you know mostly the most fair game, I think, except chess, for example?
The most fair game? No, I don't know from the top of my head. What would be a good example of a fair game? We actually talk about it a lot. I'll use it just because it's close to my heart. Football is a very fair game. And there's very few things that people do in that to really behave toxically. So I think football is a good example.
Okay, thank you.